Okay, now students taking this course in the past have said that they like to have case studies presented to them to illustrate the points made about the different paradigms that we discuss in the first part of the lecture program. And in this lecture segment, I'm going to present you with one such case study, which relates to the assessment of the social impact of a big mining project in Papua New Guinea. To introduce you to this case study, I'm showing you here a slide which shows how the process of planning this particular mine was organized during the period starting in 2007. At the bottom you can see that the company concerned, which at the time was a company called Xstrata, one of the world's larger mining companies, submitted an environmental inception report to the Papua New Guinea government in 2009, as it was required to do under the terms of the Environment Act. And the company then commissioned an international consultancy firm called Coffee, and the particular division of that firm which deals with environmental impact assessment to undertake such an assessment in the period from 2010 to 2011. Now, how did I get involved in this study? Well, I was asked to function as a peer reviewer of this social impact study, not to do the assessment myself, but to peer review the assessment produced by Coffee and the impact statement that emerged from that assessment prior to its submission to the PNG government for approval of an environmental permit to be granted under the Environment Act. Now, I should point out that this mine has not actually been built, so while the timetable here suggests that the building of the mine would actually start in 2013, there is as yet no sign of any mine being built. In fact, it may never be built because the particular mineral deposit at issue here, which is a large and rather low-grade copper deposit in a fairly remote part of the country, has been under investigation now for almost 50 years. And in fact, 2011 was not the first year in which I got involved in thinking about the potential social impact of this project. I first got involved some years previously, if my memory serves me correctly, in about 1997, when another company was investigating this deposit and wanted to commission some baseline studies of the local communities in the area, so I helped to organize that. And it may also be noted that Xstrata, the company that was interested in the potential development of this mine during the period from 2007 to about 2012, has actually lost interest in this particular project, has departed Papua New Guinea, and indeed has been taken over by another company called Glencore. So Xstrata, come Glencore, is no longer involved in this project. There are other companies involved in assessing its feasibility, possibly producing more studies. But so far, to the best of my knowledge, no environmental impact statement or socio-economic impact statement has as yet been submitted to the PNG government, and certainly no environmental permit has yet been granted for this project. Okay, so that's a bit of background. Now let's have a look at where this project is, and in particular think about the relevant aspects of the driver, which would be the mining project were it to be constructed and become operational at some point in the future. Now, the way that the study was conducted in 2010 and 2011 led to a suggestion that the driver here should be understood in terms of the different things that would go on between the mine area, which I'm pointing at here, which is, as I say, in a quite remote part of the country with a relatively small population of local people living around it, all the way down to this thing here, which is called a concentrate export facility. So what was being planned here was First of all, the construction of a hydro dam, a hydroelectric facility to supply power to the mining operation. And behind that hydroelectric facility would involve building a dam, so there would be a kind of a large area of land that would be inundated as a result of that. Behind that there would be a tailings dam to collect the waste material from the mine processing plant. The mine itself and the processing plant would produce a copper concentrate, which would then be moved by pipeline down this corridor here, which you see constitutes a sort of a second zone of impact. And at this point here, where it arrives at one of the two biggest rivers in Papua New Guinea, which is the Sepik River, the concentrate would be transshipped onto barges, moved onto barges, and the barges would then take the concentrate all the way down this river here, down this river, right to the mouth of the river, and then around the coastline here to this concentrate export facility, where the concentrate would basically be stored and then transshipped onto bigger vessels that would take it overseas for further processing. So that was basically the way that the project was being designed. Okay, and as a result of that design, you can see that the people who are going to be affected by this project would fall into different areas or zones, which are the zones indicated on this map. Let's have a look at these a little bit more closely. So if you think of the project in that way, we've thought about some relevant features of the driver. There are others I haven't discussed here, like how many people would be employed and things like that, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's think about different types of receptor or different types of impacted community in the area that would be affected if this project were to be developed and become operational. From what we've seen already on the map, you could imagine that we can divide this area into different zones according to the extent of the impact that people would experience. In fact, according to the draft social impact statement that I had to review, there were basically 3 villages upstream, close to the mine, in which some or all of the inhabitants would have to be resettled in order to make way for project facilities, specifically for the dam and the reservoir behind it that I mentioned before. And they would also lose access to some of their territory because it would be inundated by the reservoir. There are also a number of villages in the sort of upstream area in which some or all people would lose access to some of their territory but would not have to be resettled. That would be true of people living along the pipeline corridor, which would have a road going alongside it, and also the point on the main river, the Sepik River, at which the concentrate would be shifted from the output of the pipeline onto the barges that would take it downstream. And there were lots of other villages, both upstream and downstream, right down to where the concentrate export facility was to be built, in which some or all people would experience what in the business we call a significant loss of amenity without actually losing access to any of their territory. And that loss of amenity would include things like having barges go past your village once or twice a day. That would constitute a loss of amenity. All right, now let's look at some of these areas a little bit more closely. Here's a close-up of the first 2 areas that I mentioned before, the mine area here, and you can see the area of inundation, which is this blue area, the hydropower reservoir. Okay, there would be a mine waste facility here, a tailings dam, as I indicated, built here to stop the waste material getting into the river system. Here would be the open pit that would be excavated, and another waste dump over here for solid waste material. Okay, and here is the pipeline that I mentioned before, going all the way down to the Sepik River here at a place called Krupkine. What you can see here is that on the legend here, there are several villages in the area which are described here as SIA villages, and what that means is that in the course of conducting the social impact assessment, the consultants employed by Coffee actually visited these villages, often in company of people employed by the mining company itself, and spoke to the inhabitants about how they felt about the potential impact of the mine. So you can see that most of the villages in the area immediately around the mine and the pipeline corridor were in fact included in the social impact assessment to the extent of being consulted about the project and informed about how it would affect their environment. Okay, lots of studies in this area, lots of consultation in this area. But that's not so true of the river corridor. Now, the important point about this zone, okay, from the transshipment point here all the way down to the mouth of the river here, is that there is a much, much larger population of people living in villages all the way along this river than are found in the mine area or along the route of the pipeline and the road corridor. So these people had been consulted to a much smaller extent. So if you look at the legend here, the SIA village thing here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 places where local people were consulted about the project in 2010. But of those 7 places, in fact, 1, 2, and 3 are actually government stations. So they have a mixed population because they are government stations. They have things like school, educational and health facilities located in them. And only 4 of them were actually villages. So that was a much smaller proportion of the total population that was likely to be affected that was actually consulted. And what was interesting about the consultation process is that local people expressed almost universal opposition to the project because they feared that the mine would actually pollute the river in some way, and this would have a rather drastic effect on their livelihoods in one way or another. So it wasn't simply that they were disturbed by the prospect of barges travelling up and down the river and possibly interfering with the traditional canoe traffic that you find on this river. They were also exceedingly paranoid about the potential environmental impacts of the mine itself. And I was aware of this because my wife's village, if you remember me talking about that before, is located about there where that arrow is now pointing. Not all that far, although it takes quite a while by canoe, from the government station at Anth8008 here. So to get to my wife's village, we have to go in a motor canoe up here, and then we divert off the main river into a wetland system, which is where my wife's village is located. So I already knew from conversation with my wife's relatives how even they, living some way off the main river, were disturbed by what they saw as the environmental impacts of the exploration process itself, which had been going on for more than 40 years at the time when I spoke to them. And some of them, of course, actually lived in the government station here at Anth8008. And the people who lived there would point out to me sometimes that they had seen dead fish floating down the river, and they thought that the fish had died because of some kind of chemical pollution going on around the potential mine site, simply as a result of the drilling and exploration activity that was going on there. Although that activity has not been going on continuously for the last 50 years, it's been quite sporadic. But this is the sort of situation we often encounter, a kind of a fear, basically, whether reasonable or unreasonable, a very high level of anxiety about the potential environmental impacts of a project like this. Okay. Now, the way that Coffee Environments, as a division of the company, actually approaches the business of social impact assessment can be represented here. They divide social impacts into 10 different categories, and I've listed them here in the order in which they deal with them, and did deal with them in the draft social impact study that they produced for this project. They start with community layout and amenity. They end with culture and customs. I must say I don't find this particular scheme of classification terribly convincing. I can't see, for example, quite what the purpose is of distinguishing between land and water resource and use here under point 3 and domestic water use and sanitation here under point 9. I would have thought that these things are quite closely related to each other, and insofar as they are closely related to each other, I can't see why you would deal with one quite early on in a report and the other one much later. But this is the template that Coffee uses for all the social impact studies that it undertakes in any part of the world. It must be noted here that the reason that Coffee has really come to dominate the business of doing environmental and social impact assessment for big resource projects in Papua New Guinea is because at some stage it took over an Australian company called Natural Systems Resources that had already developed a speciality in this particular country with respect to large resource projects like mining, oil and gas projects. Okay, but this is a universal template. So as far as Coffee is concerned, any social impact study should be organized in this way. Now, the other thing that's notable about the way that Coffee does social impact assessment is that they use something which they call a matrix of significance. And in fact, they're not alone in doing this. It could be said that this is a sort of a typical way in which consultancy firms around the world actually approach the business of both environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment under what I'm calling the environmental planning and monitoring paradigm. And you can see that they do this by constructing tables which have basically two dimensions to them. One is what they call the magnitude of impact, and the other is what they call the sensitivity of the receptor. And you can see definitions underneath this particular matrix of what these two things are. The magnitude of an impact is defined as the amount and type of change, including the severity, geographic extent, and duration of the impact, while the sensitivity of the receptor is defined as the susceptibility of the society to change, including its capacity to adapt to or accommodate the kinds of changes that the project may bring about. So what this matrix is basically telling us is that kind of if you have a high and negative magnitude of impact, if the impact is big and it is negative and the receptor has a high level of sensitivity to that impact, and by implication a low capacity to cope with it, then you have an extreme impact here, which is highlighted in this sort of dark red color here. All right, but if the sensitivity is low and the magnitude of the impact is low, even if it is negative, then you end up with a negligible impact. And of course, this matrix does allow for positive impacts, right? But rather interestingly, the sensitivity of the receptor doesn't seem to matter here, because if an impact is positive, then it doesn't really matter whether or not the people who are affected by it are able to cope with it or not, because it's a good thing. Now, so that matrix of significance is basically the matrix that they applied to every specific impact that they were able to identify. So each specific impact derived from their scoping exercise, each specific impact of the driver on the receptors was basically subjected to this matrix in order to work out how big the impact would be and how sensitive the receptors would be to that impact. Here's an example of the way that this was done. Here's an example of one specific social impact that was identified in the scoping exercise for this study. In the mine area, that is the area immediately around the mine site. You see the social impact category derived from that previous list of 10 categories that I showed you before. This is the one called demography and population. I think it's number 2. You go back and check if you like. And within that category, they created some subcategories. So the subcategory in this case, they said, okay, we can divide that category into a number of subcategories. One would be the direct impact on the population of this immediately mine-affected area from the presence of a new workforce brought into the area to build and operate the mine. And what specific impact might they identify under that category and that subcategory? There were several of them, but one of them was this one. The population will increase with the influx of outsiders employed in construction and operation of the project. Okay, that's a specific impact. That's a specific social impact on the receptors who basically are the inhabitants of the area immediately affected by the mining operation and the construction of this hydropower facility. What measures could be used then to manage or mitigate this impact? And the measure that was proposed was that the company, in developing this project, should maximize employment of people from villages in the immediately affected area, while the other workers who could not be recruited from those villages because there simply weren't enough skilled people in those villages would be employed on what we call a fly-in, fly-out basis. That is to say, they would not live permanently in the area. They would not bring their families with them. They would work typically in the mining industry 2 weeks on, 1 week off. They would be, most of them, men living in single men's quarters. They would leave their families behind in their place of recruitment. They would be flown in, work for maybe 14 days, fly out, have 7 days field break with their families, then come back in again. This is the way that many large-scale mining operations now operate, and we'll see that in a subsequent discussion. Okay, so there's an example of the way that a specific social impact is dealt with under this way of doing the assessment. And you can see here, if we place that impact alongside a number of other specific impacts that belong to this category of impacts that relate to population and demography, you can see this kind of table being produced in the impact assessment report. So you've got a number of impacts here. So the one we've just looked at, direct impact on population from mining workforce, and then there's another one here, indirect impact on population from in-migration and temporary visitors to the area, indirect impact on population from increased wealth, which is thought to lead to, amongst the local villagers, increased lifespan, lower infant mortality, that's a good thing, direct impact on community demographic from the mine workforce, indirect impact on community demographic from in-migration. And you see them, don't worry too much about the way that they've distinguished between these different types of impact. What you can see here is the way that they're applying their magnitude and sensitivity measures here. And what they're doing here is saying, kind of, if we adopt some management measure or some mitigation measure, what will be the impact after that measure has been adopted? How big will the impact be? How sensitive will the receptors be to that impact after the company has done something to mitigate the impact, following the various recommendations made in the report? And you see how they've applied their sort of marking scheme to this, a rather simple one. Low, low leads to negligible impact at the end of the day. Medium, medium leads to a moderate impact rating. The positive one we've already mentioned. Okay, so it's really like a way of ticking boxes, this kind of way of doing impact assessment. But the point I want to pick up on here is the rather interesting distinction made in this table between direct and indirect impacts. Okay, it's hard to talk about it in terms of this particular table, so I'm going to talk about it in more general terms, leaving our matrix of significance behind. Here is a quote from the report in which I had to review, in which the coffee consultants basically put forward their way of understanding this distinction between direct and indirect impacts. Direct social impacts are said to be those which arise directly from adverse impacts upon the biophysical environment as caused by the development, while indirect social impacts are said to be, and I quote here, secondary socio-economic effects that are reasonably expected to manifest themselves and are normally best handled by the responsible national, provincial or local level government agencies. Now, when I read that, a couple of questions immediately occurred to me, which I actually put to the authors of the draft report that I was reviewing. I mean, first of all, does the influx of these fly-in, fly-out mine workers from elsewhere, whether other parts of Papua New Guinea or overseas, does it count as a direct impact because they are expected to cause some damage to the biophysical environment? I'm not entirely sure what that damage would consist of if they were required to basically live in these single men's quarters or single persons quarters in a fenced compound around the mine site and the processing plant. So it wasn't quite clear what kind of direct impact they were expected to have on the biophysical environment. But the other question, which I find to be rather interesting, is why should the company be absolved from any responsibility for managing or mitigating indirect impacts such as the influx of outsiders who are not employed by the company or its contractors in construction and operation of the project? Why should that be solely a government responsibility? Is this distinction between direct and indirect impacts, the direct ones being ones that the company is responsible for managing and mitigating, and the indirect ones being impacts which the government is responsible for managing and mitigating, does that actually really make sense in this kind of social and political environment? Now, in my own comments on the draft report that I was asked to review, I went on to discuss this in a little bit more detail. And these are quotes from the report that I submitted to both to Coffee and to Xstrata. The first point I made this is that really what seems to be emerging from this way of thinking about direct and indirect impacts is that direct impacts should be defined as the social effects of changes made to the biophysical environment by the construction and operation of the project, while indirect impacts should be defined as the rest of the specific social changes which can be attributed to the project. Okay, regardless of what responsibility government agencies might or might not have for managing such impacts. Now, thinking about that a little bit more, I said this. I said, well, loss of land or other resources by local landowners would count as a direct impact. I mean, I'm thinking here, for example, of the land that would be inundated by construction of the hydroelectric dam. While social changes, like increased alcohol consumption, brought about by the payment of compensation for such loss would then count as an indirect impact. I'm just trying to sort of work out exactly what the Coffee consultants had in mind here. So direct impacts would include those negative impacts for which impacted people deserve to be compensated through a compensation agreement, which is actually required under PNG legislation. Even though some direct impacts, like, for example, increased market access as a result of construction of the new road that would be built alongside of that pipeline corridor between the mine site and the river, could be described as positive impacts, and indeed were described as such in the draft impact study. But there's a two-way process at work here, and that can be illustrated by the following points. When PNG villagers receive lots of money in the form of compensation, royalties, wages, or selling things to the mining company or its contractors, when they receive lots of money from the construction and operation of a big mining project, they normally spend much less time on their traditional subsistence activities like gardening, hunting, fishing, and so forth. Okay. Now, the receipt of this extra money, which is actually encouraged by government policy, it's not simply that companies want to employ local people. Government actually requires them to do their best to employ local people, and also requires them to basically pay compensation, and also gives them a share of the royalties which the government itself collects from such a big mining project. Surely the receipt of this extra money constitutes a direct socio-economic impact of the project. And if the reduction of time spent on subsistence activities has a separate impact on the biophysical environment, which actually could be a positive impact or it could be a negative impact, that is surely itself an indirect environmental impact of the mining project. So think about this a little bit in terms of the model I have presented to you in a previous lecture. Here's your driver up here. This is a big mining project. Okay. It has environmental impacts, it has socio-economic impacts. The environmental impacts are impacts on the biophysical environment, the socio-economic impacts are impacts on the socio-economic environment. But notice that these arrows go in both directions, both between the different types of impact and between the different types of environment related to those impacts. If the arrows go in both directions, then surely there is no obvious reason to think that biophysical impacts are more direct or less indirect than socio-economic impacts. Except that this way of thinking, that biophysical impacts are more direct than socio-economic impacts, is typical of the environmental planning paradigm under which this study was undertaken. And that is why I couldn't go as far as I would have liked to have done in criticizing the way that the consultants had drawn their distinction between direct and indirect impacts.